So happy Women's History Month to everyone. My name is Kelly Gibo, and we are excited to present the Fireside Chat tonight on Susan, Linda, Nina, and Cokie, the extraordinary story of the founding mothers of NPR on behalf of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine Women's Professional Advancement Council, or the WPAC. The WPAC is part of the Office of Faculty, and I really am happy to be here today, and I'm going to turn it over to my co-chair, Dr. Dawn Laporte. I think Dawn is still muted.
All right. Sorry, just let me unmute. Thank you. The WPAC is part of the Office of Faculty, and we'd like to thank Dr. Maria Oliva, Vice Dean for Faculty, and Dr. Jenny Lee, Senior Associate Dean for Women in Science and Medicine, for their support of this event, and say a huge thank you.
Okay, sorry. I realized that I needed Kelvin to unmute me. I'm Wendy Chen. I'm from the Department of Plastic Surgery. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight for this book. Thrilled and honored to have with us tonight the author, Lisa Napoli. Today's author was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and began her career as an unpaid teenage intern at CNN New York Bureau in 1981. Early in the rise of the World Wide Web, she covered the intersection of technology and culture at the New York Times, Cyber Times, on MSNBC, and for public radio's Marketplace and KCRW, which is the first public radio station that I ever listened to, KCRW in Los Angeles. She has written books about the man who made the McDonald's fortune and her own experience starting as a radio station in the Kingdom of Bhutan, and also worked on documentaries. And now she is currently chipping away at a very unique master's degree in biography and memoir at CUNY Graduate Center in New York. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
So I mentioned that I started listening to NPR over 20 years ago, and I still listen every single day when I get into my car. I have a Nina Toten bag, which you can no longer find on the websites. So these names are super familiar to me. They're everyday names, and I'm so excited that you're sharing your time with us today and just about your research about the book and the writing of the book. So everybody in the chat, please feel free to throw questions in there and we will include them. We also had some questions submitted ahead of time. But to get started, Lisa, can you start off by just introducing your book? Tell us a little bit about, of all the topics in the whole wide world, why you chose to tell this piece of media history or herstory, why this story matters.
Wow, it should seem obvious, right? You know, women's stories always matter and they're never told as much and in depth as they should. I had just finished a book as the pandemic was dawning about the dawn of CNN, which, as you mentioned, is where I started my career many years ago when the whole media ecosystem was completely different for anybody old enough to remember that. And my editor, who happened to be born the same year that CNN was, which is 1980, young guy, really great guy, Jameson Stoltz at Abrams Press, said to me, "I loved working with you. I love telling this story. What else you got?" And I knew that NPR was turning 50 the next year. I had done the book about CNN because it was turning 40. And publishers love milestones because it makes it slightly easier to market. And he's a very progressive guy. And so he said, you know, I said, the story of NPR is interesting, but what's so interesting is that people don't realize that these four women were so essential to the creation of the network. And here's why. And he said, go for it, but you got to get it done fast. And so I did. And it was a hard thing to research very quickly, but thankfully, because those women are so well known and prolific in their own ways, it was slightly easier. So that's why. And I mean, to your question about why is it important, you know, I think especially with anything, I told the story of the creation of McDonald's, not because I wanted to tell the story, but the creation of McDonald's, which, whether you like McDonald's or not, and you're all in a profession that probably doesn't love it, the woman who inherited that fortune gave it away Joan Kroc, amazing person. So all of these iconic brands and people in our history, good, bad, and, gray area, are interesting stories. And no one really understood that NPR couldn't have happened if it hadn't happened because of these women. They were not the leaders per se, but they were instrumental in massive ways in making this network a success, when really it could very easily have not gone in that direction.
Absolutely.
Thanks. For those who may not know, can you tell us a little bit about each of these four women? Maybe, in a sentence or a couple of sentences for each, tell us about their distinct personalities and how that led to a voice for NPR.
Sure. Yeah. No, it is interesting too, because certain people of a certain age don't even remember Susan Stamberg, who for many years was just the voice of NPR to anyone. I mean, of course, there were many voices on NPR, but she became synonymous with the network. And so much so that her voice is in the elevator when you go to NPR headquarters. You hear her greeting you. Even though she's been off the air for quite some time. She's in her 80s now. Susan Stamberg was amazing. All of these women are amazing second wave feminist stories, even if they aren't known to you, because they were all women at a certain moment in time who managed to get an education, which was not obviously a foregone conclusion for women at that, in the 60s, 50s, 60s. But Susan had come from probably one of the scrappier backgrounds. She working class-ish family in New York City, got into Barnard, got her MRS, marrying a wonderful man who was a Harvard-educated lawyer, and was bored out of her mind because she was relegated to reception jobs in DC, where her husband had gone to work, and wanted to do something more. It was hard for women in the 60s to do something more, particularly in journalism, although she wasn't even really wired to be a journalist the way some of the other women were. And she just sort of happened into a job at a local educational radio station, meaning it was really low pay, but she was able to do that job because of her husband. Um, and that sort of introduced her to public radio. I'll go quickly through them all and then we can get deeper. Susan Linda. Linda really was the first woman hired at NPR. And she had come from New Mexico. She was a butcher, a daughter of a butcher. And so she's an interesting person too, because she was always great at school. She got out of the West and came east to college at Wellesley because someone had whispered in her ear, you could do that. You can aspire to go to a better school. And she did. And she made her way in the field again, told every step of the way, women are just in the secretarial pool. That's about as far as you'll go. And especially since she got married, that was, of course, many of you know, if not from your own experiences from your mothers, that was sort of a death sentence for your career when you got married. Okay, so Susan Linda Nina was particularly interesting because, of course, she's still out there. She's a well-known person. She defined the kind of journalism that she does. Very few people covered the Supreme Court the way she does. Well, no one's covered it the way she does, but that she did it in broadcasting and made it compelling to all of us, even if we're not lawyers, is an incredible testament to her force. But she came to DC unmarried, as opposed to the other women, and she basically just barreled through various jobs that led her, really quite accidentally, as they all were, to this network that was kind of nothing. It wasn't like going to NPR today. If you had a daughter who told you, I got a job at NPR, you'd be so proud. It wasn't the case back then. And then, of course, Cokie Roberts is probably arguably the most widespread famous of all, partially because of her famous family in Congress, but mother and father in Congress, very storied history, but also married a journalist and was also on the MRS track. She was not wired for a great profession and came to DC with her husband, found herself bored as her kids got older, and uh, again, sort of lucked into a job at this place that really needed muscle. And all four of them together became dear friends and the voices, the earliest voices of the network. So it's really a story. When I talk about this book, it's not really, you don't have to listen, just like my book about CNN. CNN today is nothing like it was back then. It's much the story of how information traveled, and this emerging media culture that we live in today. It's also about second wave feminism, how women made their ways in the world professionally and personally at a time when things were very different than they are now.
Lisa, that's fascinating. Thank you for those stories. I'm sure that there are many things that you couldn't put in the book. What were one or two of the things that you thought were most fascinating that you just couldn't quite get in? And you know, could you share that with us?
I'm not so sure that there were things that I mean, I'm sure I came across information, Cokie Roberts' mother, it was such an interesting person, in and of herself, obviously a different earlier generation, uh, just an incredible wife and mother to her family. And when her husband died, uh, Hale Boggs, she rose up and ran for office and found herself in an incredibly improbable position for a woman at that time, especially one who hadn't been wired for that world. So her story is really incredible, and I tell a little bit of it. When you write a group biography, it's a different sort of challenge because you have to have blinders on to certain things. There's a new book coming out it's either today or next week about the full-on history of the network. And I think I'm sure it's fascinating. The writer is an incredibly gifted writer, Steve Oney, and it's from the very beginning till now, all the challenges the network faced. But I liked zeroing in and telling the story through the lens of these women and the men who were there at the very beginning. Um, so it was a very spare kind of thing. And like I say, I can't think of too much that made the cut that landed on the cutting room floor that I thought, oh, I wish I could put this in here.
As you were saying, NPR now is like a household name and like kind of this trusted, fairly neutral source. And you, as somebody who has grown up in journalism, whether you put your lens on as a female journalist looking at the history or not, how did this writing this book change any preconceptions you had about NPR, about the history of women in journalism? Anything that surprised you as you researched the book?
Well, certainly, I started working in 1981 when I was 17 years old. And so I knew things, I knew from my mother, and I knew I'm from a working class family. I'm the first in my family to go to college. I knew that things had been different in the working world. My mother, if she'd been born to a different family at a different moment of time, would have probably gone to school and become a stockbroker, which she did many years later when she was a younger woman. And so I knew her struggles, but to read the stories and learn the stories about the struggles of these four women, who I took for granted. I mean, I just never occurred to me what they must have had to go through to get to the jobs, and not just the jobs, but to the esteem that they found themselves with was really remarkable. It's true. I think that's why I love biography and why I'm studying it in graduate school at age 61, because I just find biography so fascinating, whether it's of someone, a Madeleine Albright, someone incredibly famous, or whether it's of someone's mother who is not incredibly famous, but who has, had an interesting life. I just think it's so important. And so to examine more about these women's lives was just really, really a privilege and exciting. And it was shocking to me that no one had ever done it before, too. So.
I think our discussion is generating some interest here in the chat because sometimes people use this as a seg to actually reading the full book. And so one of our attendees asks, in your book, you write a little bit about this, but maybe you can talk a little bit more about this here for the people who haven't read the book. What was NPR like when it was being born as a workplace for women? Was it more progressive than other places? Was it just as problematic as other places? And if you could highlight some of the crazy challenges that some of the women encountered in working at NPR.
Sure. It's so interesting because, like many places, even today, of course, the tone is set by the people in charge. And it's important to remember that when NPR started, public radio as an entity was just starting because President Johnson had signed this public broadcasting bill. He wanted to create an alternative to commercial television and radio, really television, but radio got tacked on because people were starting to worry about the menacing force, the health consequences of media, very much similar to the kinds of conversations that we have today about social media and internet use and abuse and phone addiction. People were having back in the 50s and 60s as television was rising up. And so there was a man who was hired to run NPR, to crew up NPR when it was first launched. And it was just going to be one program once a day, and it was going to feed out, which of course was a different world, to all these stations in all these disparate parts of the country. And this man named Bill Siemering, who's considered the father of NPR, was an incredibly progressive person in many ways, not just in the ways that we think of today, but he almost didn't hire Linda Wertheimer when she said that she'd gone, as she said proudly, to Wellesley, that she was a graduate of Wellesley, because he thought that meant that she was a rich kid. And Bill Siemering wanted people who were more populist. He wanted the diversity and inclusion that we talk about today. They didn't call it that, but he wanted a racial and gender and class diversity among his staff because he knew that he was going to be speaking, his program was going to be speaking to the entire country. And, at that time, that was, it's relevant now, but it was particularly relevant in the early 70s because you couldn't just dial up on your computer The Guardian or Wall Street Journal or world-class publications the way you can now. If you subscribe to a publication like that, it might show up in your mailbox weeks later. So Bill Siemering understood that by starting this network, this national public radio network, even with this show that was going to be an hour and a half a day to start, that his voices were going to be landing. Sorry for the sirens in the background here in New York. His voices were going to be landing in cars and ultimately in kitchens all over the country, and not just cosmopolitan places. And he wanted to make sure that he had different people behind the scenes and in front of the microphones, telling the stories of the United States and the world at a time when now, I always say, I don't have my phone right here in front of me, but your cell phone, how we're all meeting, is a TV studio. But that was most definitely not the case in the early 70s. And Bill Siemering understood that he had this incredible opportunity. So in someone else's hands, he could have just mimicked exactly what any other radio station was doing, but he didn't want to do that.
Yeah. And where did you find all this information?
Oh, well, here's where I give my commercial for archives. I've never been to Johns Hopkins archives, and I'm sure there are amazing libraries there. There's always one Rosetta Stone when you write a book, a biography. And in this case, it was University of Maryland has a research library called Hornbake. And the Hornbake Library has become a repository for a lot of broadcasting archives, the way the University of Texas has a really incredible popular culture archive. And when I say archive, for people who haven't done archival research, I'm not just talking about your local library, which is amazing and important. I'm talking about places that either acquire people's personal archives or source archives for researchers to come in and mine through. So everything isn't there. Yale Beinecke is another very famous repository. And basically at the Hornbeck archive, it turned out that Susan Stamberg, who was a meticulous, crazy archivist, the kind of person whose husband probably was saying, throw that stuff out. There's so much. She had kept her papers from the High School of Music and Art and her English papers at Barnard. And she just had this incredible repository of every memo in the earliest days of the creation of NPR. So thankfully, that kind of place is open to people like me. And so I went in for a week and I just mined through her archives. And because I'd done that homework, I called her up and I said, I called her up beforehand and she was sort of reluctant to talk to me. Cokie Roberts had just died. She, all of the women, she was speaking for all of the women when they said, we're really not interested. But when I went into that archive and I read the love letter, she left them there. I wasn't invading her privacy. She left love letters from her husband, who was stationed in India when they were first married. She had all kinds of materials in the earliest days of NPR, fan mail. I knew that Susan Stamberg was famous and popular and revered, but I read her fan mail when people wrote actual fan mail in snail mail and sent her shawls and presents and I mean all kinds of things. And there it all was in this library. So when you're in a research library, the research librarians are happy and interested in who you are and what you're there to research. And they kept bringing out more. We have this uncatalogued file from a man who I think was the third NPR president. We're going to bring it out for you. So it's really fun. You have to be wired a certain way to do that kind of research, but it's actually, believe it or not, more reliable. And I say this, to anybody here who I hope will do some sort of family research with elders, put the iPhone down and record the elders. Going through these papers was more reliable than actually talking to Susan Stamberg herself, because I said to her, Susan, you have something in your archive about you wanted to start a women's show at one point, for the housewives in the mid 70s. She said, oh my God, I forgot about that. That's amazing. Wow. And I, sent a picture of the memo to her and she said, oh yeah, that never went anywhere, but yeah, that's incredible. So archives are amazing in addition to talking to people, of course, and stitching together. It's really forensic. I mean, you're stitching together history in myriad sources that are not always easily apparent. And that is why it's very similar to family history, because of course you have aunts and uncles and people all over who have different shoe boxes filled with photographs that no one has ever seen. And you sort of triage it as a biographer, you triage it into something that hopefully a couple people will read, or at least someone will invite you to come talk about.
I think it's really interesting because in our line of work, it really also is true that until people kind of realize that you care about them, they may not necessarily open themselves up to you as their physician and be very forthright with you. And I think that kind of leads to this next audience question, which is, as a physician, sometimes you have to be really resourceful as well, to get things going or to meet people or get people to do things for you. And so when these people, I recently was reading the Connie Chung memoir. And
I worked on that. I was
yeah.
I was the ghostwriter. Yeah.
Oh, really? And so that's really interesting. And so it's like, at that day and age, being who they were, being women, how did they get access to so many important people when they were kind of early in their career for early media source? And I think this is going to lead next to Dr. Laporte's question about power. But firstly, just getting FaceTime, getting any time with people and getting them to talk.
Well, of course, and broadcasting has a certain bizarre level of intimacy and distance that's different than if you and I just meet back there and we run into each other in the ladies' room and talk to each other. That was Nina's background, was in print. And so she was a really dogged and excellent reporter because she was used to rooting out sources that way. But the truth is that women were so unusual in DC, and Connie was in that club, maybe a little bit younger than the women in the book. Uh, she was in that world at a time when it was extremely unusual to see a woman running around Washington, D.C. with a microphone or a camera crew or a notepad. And so there were some men who would talk to women just because they were women, even if they were condescending, which they often were, but not always. Some men got it, but they also got it too, that these women were conduits to the general public. And so, especially with Connie, because she was so visible, so famous, the NPR women, I think they became well-known commodities around the Hill. Even though their faces weren't on television every night, although Linda and Cokie did do a fair amount of public television, and Cokie certainly had grown up on Capitol Hill. But yeah, it is interesting how they had to push back against a lot of, catcalls and abuse, but they knew they had to do that to prevail. They couldn't walk away, or they say they couldn't walk away. They chose not to walk away and just sort of pushed up against whatever, misogyny they were running up against in order to get a story. It is I've been a broadcaster myself, and I have to say I do not. I've been on public radio, and I was on MSNBC for a couple of years, and it is a different world of running after someone when you have a device as opposed to running after them to talk to them. So the fact that these women, had this voice, uh, by the way, just tangentially changed women's and people's perception in the country, because they were hearing voices delivering the news for the first time. And, this was at a moment in time when women didn't necessarily just come out and talk about politics at dinner. And now all of a sudden you're turning on the radio or the TV and you're hearing women talking about heavy, weighty matters that they hadn't been allowed to speak about publicly, I mean, privately before, and now they're delivering the news. So that helped really change and inform how the American public felt about women generally, professionally. And that's why the story is also so important. And the Connie book it was really, really fun to work with her, because I grew up watching her, and not just grew up, I mean, as a young professional, I was watching her, and to hear what she went through, and persevered against, was really immense and not sadly surprising. But they weren't going to let them stop them. So
Yeah, certainly she was a household name for me as an Asian American child. It wasn't about what her job was, it was just that she was visible, you know?
yeah. Oh, yeah. No, and it's a fabulous story about her, that book came about because some young woman, I can't remember if the woman who tracked her down was named Connie Chung, but she was Connie, and she recognized that all these women in her generation were named
What?
Connie because they were all named for Connie Chung, because the families admired this, incredible success story. And yeah, that must have been, I know it was mind blowing for Connie to get that call.
Yeah.
Very cool. Building on that, you write that they weren't women in power, they were women of power, and to know your power and use it. Can you elaborate a little bit more about women and power and how we might have to go about things a little differently than the men?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, they at one point, there was a possibility that they could actually run the show. It was such a fluid place. It was constantly growing and changing. And, if any one of them had said, I want to be in charge, they could have. And they didn't want that. They wanted to be sort of more organically involved and terrorize the people who did run the place by giving their opinion and explaining why they should hire certain people or not, and do certain things or not. And it is a very important decision that we make as people, as women. But I never wanted to go run something. I knew what was important to me. I wanted to tell the stories. I didn't want to be the person in charge of the people telling the stories, which is a whole different kind of art. One of my dear friends is a doctor, and she recognized that she did want to be in management. She went back and got her MBA. So everybody's wired differently, but that's, I think, really the message that I got from these women, and from any women I've seen who are successful in my career, that you just understanding what works for you and how to navigate the system that you find yourself in. I don't mean to oversimplify it, because I know it's not that simple, but it's understanding where you can fit in the ecosystem, rather than making the ecosystem fit around your particular needs. Now, that said, people are entrepreneurial and wired for that. And that's a different sort of system. When we're in journalism, back when I was starting in journalism, now today I could create a brand just sitting right here on my desktop, and I could be anything from Randy Rainbow to, you can be very famous without having an organization behind you. But then at that time, you had to be part of that system if you wanted to have a voice. And those women understood that the women with the microphone were the women with the real power, not the women who were running the show. That said, if Nina Totenberg had said, I want to run the show, she could have, and her career would have turned out differently. And so would many of others, because she would have organized the system in a different way. But it's knowing who you are, which of course takes us, most of us, a while to figure out. It's like figuring out the right clothing to wear. I know I can't wear that. It's really understanding who you are and how to fit in the system.
Thank you. I do want to encourage all of our participants potentially to put questions in the chat, because we'll try to get to them while we're waiting for those. At this point, women now make up more than men in medical school matriculation. And I think we offer a unique perspective at the bedside and when doctoring. And I think patients sort of relate to us differently. What do you think the women's perspective was when they were telling these stories? And why is the perspective of women important? Using the voice of a woman to tell a story versus Tom Brokaw or some of these other men who were sort of the traditional news anchors.
Well, and absolutely, at the time that these women were coming up, they were women used to be if they were allowed to tell the stories, they were relegated to what was called the women's pages, which meant they could only tell society stories or fashion stories or bridal stories or home advice stories, maybe parenting stuff. That was where women had to work. And, there were some exceptions. The notable one was a woman named Pauline Fredericks, who actually covered the United Nations at the formation of the United Nations on television. But these women recognized, as they were given these jobs at NPR, where NPR was so desperate, they couldn't afford to discriminate. They needed all hands on deck. Everybody did multiple jobs. And in many cases, they still do. And the women realized that their perspective, of course, each one of our perspectives is different, but they recognized that their perspective on politics and national security and healthcare and safety, on everything, was going to be different. And that was reflected in the stories that they told, the stories they chose to tell, how the audience responded to those stories. And that was something that was, again, now it sounds like, of course, it's important to have a multiplicity of voices in everything, in every conversation. But that was definitely not the case then. That was not what was represented on the air or in the bylines. Some women had to conceal their gender by concealing their, using initials instead of their name. So these women were really poised to be in a place at a moment in time when people were not used to hearing women's voices on the radios, except selling refrigerators or television. And that was and that they were the women they were from the backgrounds that they were. Nina Totenberg's father was a Jewish violinist, and he'd escaped the Holocaust, and he was an impresario. I mean, he was an incredibly talented and formidable person. Her mother was actually a college graduate, which at the time wasn't. Nina was not a college graduate, but so she came to the table with a certain sort of wiring. She wasn't wired. She's not educated in the law. She wasn't wired to be a Supreme Court justice reporter. She just wanted to tell stories. She wanted to chase after people and tell stories. And she couldn't help but tell the stories from the point of view, even though that point of view is muted, of her background. And similarly with Susan Stamberg. She wanted to get to the root of the humanity of every story. And she did. That's why she was so enormously successful. She wasn't a broadcaster reading a broadcast story with a particular sort of voice. She was sitting and interviewing you as if you were sitting in her home, and people that really resonated. So, and Cokie, had the authority of somebody who literally grew up running around Capitol Hill and understood the Hill just organically the way you understand your family home. And she loved it. She loved it. And that came through. Her knowledge and understanding. It's like listening to an athlete do color commentary or commentary of sport. They just do it better than almost anybody can because they've lived that sport. So all those voices really resonated for people, and they were just remarkable for the moment in time that they were at. So
Yeah, in your book, you say even simply Susan Stamberg's dialect, the accent that she had was like an affront for some people.
yes, yes, it's so interesting. She spoke with a very decidedly New York accent. And at that moment in time, most of what you heard on the radio was that flat Midwestern accent. Or if you listen to local radio, you heard whatever the local people sounded like, usually the local men, except for the women's hour. And there were people who pushed back against her on the radio nationally because they thought she sounded too New York, which was, of course, code for Jewish. And thankfully, Bill Siemering said, "Mm-mm, no, that's that. I don't care what you think." And he kept her on because she, to him, embodied what he couldn't have even articulated, which is this warmth and genuine curiosity and the breath, literally the breath, the non-broadcast speak of what people know of as public radio now.
Yeah. I think role mentors and role models and mentors and sponsors are so important, and it can change what you think is possible for yourself as a person or as a professional. And
100%.
for people in the context of things, this was the era of Gloria Steinem's Ms. Magazine, and the ERA and new laws were emerging to prohibit discrimination. Like you were talking about Connie Chung and the names, people named their daughters after, and like similarly in parallel, there's the Gillian Anderson effect where like just because she was a woman in the FBI and in Science on X-Files, there's a whole generation of women in those fields because of her. But I think also similarly, like the stories that are born because of these unique women are unique, and they themselves are role models and mentors and being visible and doing their work, but also their work also is a second way that things become possible. So one of the audience members' questions is, can you give examples of stories that probably would not have been told if it were not for these women or the way that they told it?
They definitely approached healthcare on the Hill
Mhm.
from the point of view of a mother. And absolutely, that was an ongoing issue. They would push back against any congressional bill and ask about, welfare of the people. Another example was they covered 3 Mile Island, the nuclear disaster, and they, went at it from the point of view of the people, not the science, but the people. That's not to say that they didn't do an adequate job covering it, but their whole idea was that they looked at the humanity of stories. There's so many, it's so hard. That was another thing that Susan had in her archive. She literally, remember those old-fashioned printouts with the little dot matrix on the side, the dot matrix printers, I mean the columns that went through, accordioned through. She had a huge printout of all of the stories I think that she'd ever done and at NPR. And I mean, I don't know how many there were. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of them. But yeah, their choices definitely reflected their personal interests, and their personal interests all went back to, family. Family was super important to them. And that's also a sad, it's not that men don't find family important too. It's just that that wasn't the wiring of the coverage back when these women were doing their thing in the earliest days.
Thanks. On that, I think a number of the stories that you shared have parallels with women or their pathway in medicine. Women are frequently taking the less desirable jobs and taking it for less pay, and working for scraps and trying to get advance their education while at the same time trying to be wives and mothers. How did these women cope and thrive in the workplace, and at the same time balance that with their other roles in their personal lives?
Well, that's a great question. And if I hope it comes through in the book, and if there is something that I wish I had been able to talk about more, it's that these women came from, each of them, as different as they were, had incredibly supportive families and unbelievably supportive spouses, which at the moment in time that they were working was not a foregone conclusion. But all four had incredible support from every direction. And that's obviously a huge part of all of our success. We all need that support system. But from the earliest days, no one said to any of them, even when Nina Totenberg went to her mother and said, I'm dropping out of school. And her mother said, all right, you could drop out of school and you have a year or so and try to make it in journalism, which is what she wanted to do. And if you don't, you got to go back to school. But she didn't say, nope, you can't do that. And that was really resonant for me as I was reading about them and learning about them, how incredibly important that was to their success. There was no sense that the spouse, Steve Roberts, was maybe a little resentful that his wife got to be so famous. He did pretty well himself too, and he's spoken a little bit about that, but mostly they were just nothing but supportive. So that's a huge influence.
One of our audiences asked a question about Barbara Walters and how she fits into the story. Were they colleagues and friends, or were they competitors?
Well, a little bit of both. In fact, it's funny because Susan is billed as the first woman to host a nightly network newscast, uh, which is true. But Barbara was the first woman to host a nightly televised newscast, which of course was, again, because NPR was not NPR back when Susan was the host of the show. She certainly wasn't making, I think it was $1 million a year that Barbara got signed to host the news. It was a big deal when it happened in the late 70s. But Susan was the first voice across the land that was female. So yeah, I think they were also dealing with different circumstances. Barbara was, glitzy glamour TV, ABC. These folks were on a network that a lot of people in big cities didn't listen to or even know about. Even though it was NPR, it wasn't the way it is today in terms of the carriage. It was carried by hundreds of stations, but it wasn't the go-to, and it wasn't on all the time. So it didn't have the cultural heft that it does, that television did, which is partially why it was created. It was created to give a non-commercial alternative to what you were seeing on broadcast TV. So it wasn't like they were head to head, but Susan was always angry when people said that Barbara was the first woman to host a nightly newscast, because she was not Barbara.
Kind of building upon that, we're in our last couple of questions here. There's a book by an anthropologist called Woman in a Surgeon's Body. This is an anthropologist who started studying surgeons as like a tribe and a different breed. And then she realized, this book was written 20 years ago, that women surgeons were actually a separate subset of that. And one of the phenomenon is about when you have a bunch of women together, it can kind of be competitive in a way that's not necessarily nourishing to each of the women. It can be kind of competitive and rival. And so, can you speak about, these women seem to stay pretty close friends over the years, even though they could easily have become, rivals and not friendly to each other. And how can women support each other and help each other to make the group and the individuals stronger and sort of rise together?
Sure. No, in fact, Connie talks about that in her memoir, about how she was broadsided when she, no bad pun intended, when she walked into one of the networks and Diane Sawyer was ganging up on her, and Barbara. And she was working for the same network. In this case, it was different because the women, I think, because the stakes were low, there was no fame in terms of, I have to be more beautiful than you or younger than you. These women, and maybe just because of the way these women were wired, they actually saw the benefit of them banding together and being a unit, as opposed to sniping against one another and tripping each other. And they could easily have done that, especially Linda Wertheimer and Cokie, because they were both covering the Hill. So it is a really interesting, and probably sadly a unique situation. It certainly was a unique moment in time, in that this place, I write about the first 10 years of NPR, when NPR almost imploded, literally, because of fiscal mismanagement, which is why NPR doesn't like my book very much, because it doesn't like to remember those days. But these women, recognized that they needed each other for the place to keep going, and they needed each other, their collective brain power, to engine the place, again, not because they were technically running it, but because they were the representatives out in the public of the place, and that gave them a certain sort of agency. So I think, how do women navigate that? I hate that we even have that conversation today, right? We should all be supporting one another, and grateful that, women like these women did the hard work before us. You have correlates in your industry as well, obviously, who suffered the worst decades ago, and as things were opening up. But it really does shock me that it's not obvious that people should be nice and supportive and helpful to everybody who's coming up behind them. But that's why I do what I do for a living, and I'm not in charge of some big corporation. But the women did see that, and they recognized that, and they jokingly called themselves the fallopian jungle. Well, someone called them that. The fallopian jungle was off in the corner. They had desks all near each other, and they schemed and plotted, and not about themselves, but about the place. They had a very maternal instinct about the whole place where they worked, and they wanted to see it succeed. That's another thing that's so hard today, right? You know, there's not a lot of corporate loyalty going along around it, not to overgeneralize. Maybe all of you are in places where that's not the case, but these women really, it was not just that they wanted each other's success and their own success, but they wanted the place to succeed. And that meant everybody had to do their best. It wasn't that mow out of the way, so I can succeed mentality. And of course, in media, as in so many other things today, there's so many more places. You would think that would be more opportunity for people to support one another, but it just makes it harder, I think, somehow to rise up.
Yeah. In the
This is
last couple of minutes, I got one last question for you before we close up here. But as you say in the epilogue, what's next? And what I mean by that is, this weekend on SNL, one of the hosts of, the Weekend Update, Michael Shea, he said, "I'm the last Black man left on this network in a major, broadcasting position." And I think back then it was hard to say that this was a turning point. Connie, Barbara, and then these four women, that was going to be kind of like a tide for women's voices. In 1 minute, what do you think is next in journalism? What do you think is milestone? What do you think is next for minority voices?
I'm just very afraid about this AI stuff, how AI impacts. Yesterday, the LA Times introduced a feature that's going to sort of AI summarize using AI various editorials that they place, and that's a scary application of it. And I think everybody in every profession is wading through the good and the bad. I mean, you had mentioned that I covered technology in the early days of the web, and I remember every profession had this conversation: what the heck is going to happen to us? What the heck is going to happen to our tried and true, dyed-in-the-wool system that has operated the way it has for however many years? And AI really accelerates that conversation in a way, particularly for those of us who get paid to write for a living. It's an efficiency that is a scary one. And I see it even as a student in graduate school, that people are using it. And that just makes me worried about what happens to future generations of journalists. I don't know if I do. I wouldn't
Yeah,
be
that's a great answer.
surprised.
We as physicians are also wondering. All right. I think maybe Dawn will close us out here.
Yeah, Lisa, we can't thank you enough. This was really amazing. I would like to turn over to Dr. Maria Oliva, our Vice Dean for Faculty, and Dr. Jenny Lee, Senior Associate Dean for Women in Science and Medicine, to close out the event. Maria?
Just with the unmute issue. So, hey, Lisa, listen, on behalf of our Office of Faculty here at the Hopkins School of Medicine, thank you very, very much. This was really an insightful and inspiring conversation. And I know that the webinar was very much enjoyed by all the many attendees who are with us tonight. Now, as we've heard, the stories of Susan and Linda and Nina and Cokie, we know that it's certainly not just about journalism. It's really stories about resilience, about breaking barriers, and paving the way, right, for future generations. And we talked tonight about how those journeys that you highlighted in many ways parallels the challenges that women still face even today in many fields, including science and medicine. And that really makes your book all the more relevant and powerful. So again, thank you for bringing the stories to life and for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you.
Dawn, Kelly, and Wendy, thank you for planning and putting together another fantastic event. And now let me pass the baton to Jenny to finish the evening off.
This was incredible. Thank you all. I loved this. And my kids are listening, and there's just so much to learn here because you talk about changing the next generation. our kids need to know this so they can make sure that we're heading in the correct direction when they are leading. So I also want to give a special thank you to the entire Women's Professional Advancement Council. We call them the WPAC. This is their idea and they are spearheading this. And my takeaway for tonight is how you talked about the importance of people coming together and supporting each other. And it takes all of us to work towards gender equity. And when I say all of us, I mean all of us of all genders. I've always believed that, and you just reaffirmed that. And thank you. This was fantastic. So we wish you all an amazing night. I'm going to ask the panelists to stay on. We're going to grab some screenshots, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Right. Thank you.